So I don't know how much you tune into American political discourse, but
I try to avoid it.
You should. So a few of the Democratic candidates point to your home country, Sweden, Scandinavian countries in general, as the model for what could work in America. We could take the wealth tax from Europe and apply it here. We could take the Scandinavian welfare model, which is progressive and high taxes, high spending, universal health care, all of these features that supposedly are working really well over in your homeland. Can you talk about conditions there? How is it working? And is this an appropriate model to be looking at importing to the United States?
Yeah. Well, let me give you the briefest economic history summary of the Swedish experience, which is kind of similar to the whole Nordic experience. Because after our politicians realized that the moment Swedes got a chance, they all left for America. They started to realize that something is going on. They're doing something over there that we should learn from. So what they did in the 1860s and 70s and 80s was, because of this groundswell of support for more openness, more democracy, more free markets in Sweden, Sweden changed completely. Opened up for free trade, for free markets, for property rights, for rule of law, for free speech and other things. And that's when Sweden started to get rich. Sweden got to be one of the richest countries on the planet until 1950, 1960, and 1970s. 100 years earlier, my ancestors in Northern Europe, they mixed bark from the trees into the bread to make it go further so that the children would survive. 100 years later, we were one of the richest countries on the planet. And we thought we had it all made. And that was based not on some sort of socialist ideals or anything like that. Back then, Sweden had a smaller government and lower taxes than other European countries, and lower than in the United States as well. That's the background story of the Nordic miracle, the Swedish miracle that people rarely hear about. Then what happened was something that often happens. Once you got rich, you thought that, okay, then we don't have to think about wealth creation anymore. Now we can start to consume resources big time. Now we can start to redistribute, now we can start to build a big government in Sweden. And in 20 years, and this is the 1970s and the 1980s, we doubled the size of government from 30 to 60% of GDP. We implemented a wealth tax, a very high one. We implemented very high income taxes. We regulated the labor market and other things. And this is what the rest of the world learned about. They saw Sweden and realized that, look, this is one of the richest countries on the planet, and yet they are implementing semi-socialist policies. It seems like it's working. You can be this rich and yet redistribute all those resources. But the story is really like that old joke. How do you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a large fortune, and then you waste lots of it underway, because that's what Sweden did. This is the precise moment in time that Sweden began to lag behind other countries. We used to be 10% richer than our neighboring countries. After 20 years of these policies, we were 10% poorer than they were. We began to see problems with the wealth tax and inheritance taxes and high income taxes. Our major companies, the ones that you might have heard about, the IKEAs of Sweden, the Tetra Paks and so on, they all left for Luxembourg, for the Netherlands, for Switzerland. Our great entrepreneurs, our great sports stars, the Bjorn Borgs of Sweden, they all left. So this was really Sweden's Atlas Shrugged moment, like in Ayn Rand's novel. The moment that government control becomes too heavy, too burdensome, the innovators, the entrepreneurs, they leave. And what happened was that this all ended in a terrible economic crisis in the 1990s. And then one person summed up the Swedish policies until then. Look, we've made a couple of mistakes. This is perverse, it's unsustainable, and it's bizarre. We have to implement free market reforms. And the person who said that was the Social Democratic Minister of Finance at the time. And then Sweden started to liberalize its economy quite dramatically, much more than other countries did in the late 80s and 90s. And lowering taxes, opening up for the public sector for private providers, like a school voucher system, for example, to implement competition between schools, abolishing the wealth tax, and then the innovators and entrepreneurs came back to Sweden and started to create jobs in Sweden again, abolishing the old social security system, which was a pay-as-you-go system, and implementing a defined benefits system rather than defined contributions rather than defined benefits, so that it would be sustainable over the long term. Many of those reforms that other countries like the US are still working on to make their own systems sustainable. So today I would say that Sweden is again outperforming many of its peers, many of its neighbors, and so on. But that's because we learned from the mistakes during this 20-year period in Sweden. And the risk right now is that many outsiders, they look at those 20 years and want to implement the same policies because their ideals are they're stuck in the 70s and 80s.